I realize you know that I'm a fantasy reader, but you don't know anything about my tastes or my history yet, so I decided to do the fantasy reader tag. Hello lovely book dragons and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be doing the get to know the fantasy reader tag because I thought it was a good way for you to get to know my tastes in the genre, and I just thought it was really a fun idea. And I'm going to be doing a few videos in this kind of genre, so I'm going to be doing this, then I'm going to do rank like my favorite and my least favorite fantasy tropes, my favorite fantasy authors, my favorite fantasy series, so that you can get to know my tastes a little bit better. But today I decided to kickstart this series of getting to know me as a fantasy reader with the tag of the same name. Question 1. What is your fantasy origin story? How you came to read your first fantasy novel? So my fantasy origin story is kind of funny because when I was a child I did not read any fantasy. I remember that Harry Potter came out when I was a kid, and my mom bought it for me in French, but she bought me this book and I couldn't get around the fantasy elements. I couldn't get around magic in the book. I didn't like it, so I didn't read it. And for a very long time I did not read any fantasy. I read classics, I read historical fiction, I read everything except for fantasy. Then fast forward a couple of years and booktube started to become a thing, and I realized all these people were reading all these YA fantasies, and I thought, okay, you know what, maybe that is the route that I should go to dip my toes into the fantasy genre. The series that got me into fantasy, I've talked about it quite a few times on this channel, is Throne of Glass by Sarah J Maas. Back in the day, Throne of Glass was all the rage. Everyone was reading it. Everyone was rating every single book in that series 5 stars, and I decided, okay, if it's this beloved, I'm gonna read it. And then the first book is not super heavy with fantasy elements, and I really enjoyed it back then. I thought it was so much fun, and that is how I got into fantasy. And another little funny story that I wanted to talk about while we talk about the origin story is that, so I was in college when all this happened. I didn't grow up speaking English, so that's why I also read a lot of YA in the beginning, because I needed to read stuff that was easy for someone who was becoming fluent in the language. So that's why I read a lot of YA. And one of my roommates, of course, she was native because I studied in America. And there was this guy that she was kind of sort of maybe dating, and he said, hey, so to get to know each other better, how about we read each other's favorite book? And I was like, wow, that is awesome. So she came home one day with this brick of a book. It was a mass market paperback. It was like this thick. I saw her read it on the couch and I told her, you know what? That's the kind of book that I will never read. The cover doesn't appeal to me. The length of the book doesn't appeal to me. I will never read that book. And that book was The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson, which is now my all-time favorite. So I thought that was so funny, like thinking back on it now when I love the Stormlight Archive. I love those characters and that world. And I think back of like 2013 Joana, who was like, I will never read that book. It's just funny. Question 2. If you could be the hero or heroine in a fantasy novel, who would be the author and what's one trope you'd insist be in the story? So the obvious answer here would be Brandon Sanderson, right? But I'm not gonna pick him because the trope I would want is not a trope that I've seen him do. And so I don't know how he would handle it, and I really want this trope. And that trope is animal companions. I want animal companions. And the 2 authors that come to mind that have done this wonderfully, and another trope I would love to be in my story, is the older mentor. And 2 authors that I'm thinking that have done both of those tropes extremely well are Robin Hobb and John Gwynne. I don't want Robin Hobb to write my story because I would be put through the ringer. Like, she would make me suffer. So I'm gonna go with John Gwynne. I would want John Gwynne to write my fantasy story, and I want him to write me an animal companion and an older mentor, just like he does in The Faithful and the Fallen series, which I love. Question 3. What is a fantasy you read this year that you want more people to read? So I'm filming this in the middle of January 2021. So I've only finished 2 books this year. So I'm gonna give you a 2020 option and a 2021 option. The 2020 option would be First Law by Joe Abercrombie. I feel like this is finally getting a little bit more popular. I didn't hear a lot of people talk about it. A lot of people have it on their radar, on their shelves, or buying it, but not reading it. And I want more people to read Joe Abercrombie because I love his books so much. The answer for 2021 is gonna then be a repeat, and that would be John Gwynne, because I feel like he's extremely underrated. He's now getting the popularity that he deserves, I feel like. And I read Malice, I'm in love with that. I have a review of it. that you should check out to see if you want to read the book or not. It's non-spoiler. And yeah, John Gwynne, definitely John Gwynne. Y'all need to get on that bandwagon because John Gwynne is awesome and definitely underrated. Question 4. What is your favorite fantasy subgenre? What subgenre have you not read much from? I'm going to give you 2 answers for each of these questions. So my favorite fantasy subgenres are 1, epic fantasy, and 2, grimdark fantasy. Those are my 2 favorites. I think I prefer grimdark over epic fantasy, but I just love those 2 subgenres a lot, and they're just my go-to fantasy subgenres. For the subgenres that I read the least of, I'm gonna tell you one that I have not really interested in reading more of, but one that I would love to read more of. The one that I don't read a lot from, and I'm okay with that, is fantasy romance. I mean, I don't have problems with there being romance in my fantasy, but fantasy romance is pretty much like it's about the romance and there's just fantasy elements, and I don't care about that. If I read a fantasy novel, I want it to be about the fantasy world. So I'm okay not reading more of that subgenre. And the subgenre that I don't read a lot from, because there is not a lot of books like that, but I would love to read more from, is flintlock fantasy. I read Promise of Blood by Brian McClellan, and it was okay. I gave it 3 stars, but I would love to read more flintlock fantasy. Alan over at the Library of Alexandria recommended Django Wexler, so I'm going to be reading that on his recommendation. But I asked him if he would do a video on flintlock fantasy, and he said yes, that he's gonna do that when he's read a little bit more, so I'm excited to see what he has to suggest. Question 5. Who is one of your autobi fantasy authors? I'm not gonna give you one, you know that, right? Okay, so let's go. Brandon Sanderson, Joe Abercrombie, John Gwynne, Robin Hobb, R.F. Kuang, Evan Winter. Did I say Brandon Sanderson? I said Brandon Sanderson. I think those are the ones that come to mind. Yes. Question 6. How do you typically find fantasy recommendations? Goodreads, YouTube, podcasts, Instagram, etc. So the obvious answer is that I find a lot of my recommendations through BookTube and also Instagram. Those are my main 2 and go-to ways of finding new recommendations. However, recently I've been finding a lot of good recommendations through Discord, because I'm on Leslie's Discord, I'm on Alan's Discord, I'm on the Shelf Space Discord, and there are a lot of good recommendations there. Something I would like to point out is that Leslie over at the Nerdy Narrative has created the Shelf Published In Discord server, which is a Discord server for self-published fantasy authors, not only fantasy, for self-published authors. And I will leave her announcement video down below where she talks about it, and I have been getting so many recommendations on there. I went on Kindle and I bought a bunch of self-published authors books because of the recommendations that I've seen there, and that is great. Question 7. What is an upcoming fantasy release you're excited for? So since it's the beginning of the year, I'm gonna say a lot of books. I'm excited for anything that my favorite authors are putting out. I'm excited for John Gwynne's new book, which it's like the Shadow of the Gods? Here it is. I'm super excited for that, but I need to catch up on all of his other books before I get to that, even though it's in a different world and I could technically read it. But I'm super excited for John Gwynne's new book. I'm excited for Joe Abercrombie's new book. I'm excited if Brandon Sanderson publishes something. I'm just excited for a lot of things, and there are a lot of books coming out this year that I'm super excited for. So yeah, it's the beginning of the year, so everything that's coming out. Question 8. What is one misconception about fantasy you would like to lay to rest? This is not a BookTube misconception, because I find that it doesn't really exist here on BookTube, or not as much. I haven't come across it a lot, but there are 2 things that I see in the real world people say about fantasy and fantasy readers. One is that it's not made for women. I was at this book fair a few years ago, and I was looking at fantasy novels that they were selling, and I was browsing through, and I had this huge tome, like 800 pages, in my hands. So then this like grown-ass man comes up to me and is like, I didn't know women read that big of books. And I was like, excuse me? He's like, and then he said, yeah, that book is huge. I didn't think women would read fantasy that is that big. And I'm like, I looked at him and I said, dude, this is also like YA fantasy. I read, what? I was so shocked that he thought that, like, in the year, it was probably 2019 or something. I was like, who says something like that? Who says something like that still? That was weird. The other misconception is that fantasy doesn't count as literature. I don't understand. Like, it's a book, you're reading it, therefore it's what? I don't see how this is a topic. Like, fantasy is amazing. People who say that fantasy is not real reading, I don't get that. I don't understand, and it's not true. Question number 9. If someone had never read a fantasy before and asked you to recommend the first 3 books that come to mind as the places to start, what would these recommendations be? This would depend on the person, of course. I always ask the person, what kind of books do you like? What do you like in books? What do you like in stories? And then I would base off of that. Since here I just have to do 3 general recommendations, I would pick three books that are completely different in tone. The first one I would pick is The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson, because it feels like it could be a standalone. You can continue, of course, and you get an amazing story, but the first book is pretty self-contained. The magic system is a hard magic system, so I would also have that person discover how hard magic systems work. You have a tight group of people, you have a crew, you have a heist, you have a hard magic system, and it's pretty self-contained, and it is a great novel. So I would recommend that one. On the other hand, I would recommend The Rage of Dragons by Evan Winter, because it is completely different in feel from The Final Empire. It is super fast paced. It is only pretty much action, military fantasy. You follow mainly our main character Tao, so it's not like this whole cast, it's more like focused on one person. It's more of a soft magic system rather than a hard magic system. So these two are pretty much opposites, and I would recommend those two because then the person could see what they like and what they don't like in fantasy. The third book I would recommend would be The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien, because it reads more like a children's fantasy. It's very classic fantasy. The writing style is very beautiful. So I would recommend that one to have a completely different feel from the other three, and they would get J.R.R. Tolkien under their belt. I mean, what's not to like? And finally, question 10. Who is the most recent fantasy reading content creator you came across that you'd like to shout out? Oh man, there are so many. So many. Okay, I'm gonna try and not go overboard, but I probably will go overboard. First one is Ali over at Kisty Reads. She's one of my good friends and I love her. Her channel is like aesthetically so pleasing. She is incredible. You have to go check her out. She is just incredible. Next up is Joana, my namesake. She just recently came on BookTube and started her channel, and she just did a super awesome Poppy War review, so you should go check that out because she is awesome. I love her channel. Abby from Abby Salter. I don't think that anyone needs to be recommended Abby because she is just like, you should follow her. If you're not following Abby, what are you doing, really? What are you doing? Because Abby is incredible. She's so kind, and the way she talks about books, I just love it. She has super original content. Abby is incredible. I of course also want to recommend Erica over at Geeklit Read Stuff. She is one of my Team McAllister friends and I just love her. And also Andrew, of course, from Get Right On In. Also my Team McAllister buddy, whom I love so dearly. And then I would also, of course, recommend some bigger channels that are not like, they're not over 10k, so, but they're still bigger than me. And that would be Leslie at The Nerd Narrative, a fave. QNTG, oh my goodness, I love them. Alan, Library of Alexandria. I mean, I've been talking about Alan a lot lately because I think he's awesome. Who else? There's so many. There are so many. And I'm just so happy that I found these people, because watching their channels, watching their content on a daily basis just makes me feel so happy. And I love talking to them about books. Oh, Madison over at Madison Goodyear. She is so fun. I love her so much as well. Guys, just go check out all these channels because these people are incredible and they deserve all the love. So go on over, click that subscribe button and show them all the love because they deserve it. So there you go, guys. That is the Get to Know the Fantasy Reader tag. I'm not going to tag everyone because this tag is so old. I think that everyone has done it. But if you haven't done it and you want to, consider yourself tagged. And yeah, that's going to be it from me today. I hope you guys are doing well and I will see you very soon with another video. Bye!